This is the Best Insurance Law Podcast, brought to you by Best Recommended Insurance Attorneys.
Welcome to Best Insurance Law Podcast, the broadcast about timely and important legal issues affecting the insurance industry. I'm John Zuba, Managing Editor of Best Recommended Insurance Attorneys. We're pleased to have with us this morning attorney Marcelo Mansur from the law firm Mattos Filho, Veiga Filho, Marrey Jr., and Quiroga Advogados in Brazil. Marcelo is a partner at the firm. He counsels insurance, reinsurance, and pension companies on regulatory, transactional, and claims matters. He has also authored several books and articles on insurance and reinsurance. And Marcelo is also involved in the most recent significant transactions and claims matters taking place in Brazil. Marcelo, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
John, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Today's discussion is on the impact of COVID-19 on Brazilian insurance and claims. And for our first question this morning, Marcelo, can you tell us a little bit about the current status of COVID-19 and its impact on Brazil?
Yes, for sure, John. Yes, we have reached a point here in Brazil, and I think maybe it's a little bit different from what we see in Europe, but it's very similar to what we see in America. We reached we didn't have what people normally call the waves. We have a plateau. So we began our increase of people being infected and unfortunately diseases, and we stayed for that for a long period. Now we are beginning to see a small reduction. In terms of numbers, we are currently reaching the number of 5 million infected people, and unfortunately the number of 150,000 people who died of the disease. We currently in Brazil we are resuming slowly activities, so people are back on the work with very few people. But there is one particular point that we have to talk about Brazil, and maybe other countries will be similar in the Americas, is that due to our economic and social situation, we have a lot of informal work. And for people who have informal work, they cannot stay at home because they depend on their work for everyday earnings. And the help from the state was very important, but took some time to start. So we had our beginning of the pandemic very chaotic, with different signals and different messages, and people need to go to the street. So that's unfortunately that the situation that we ended. So that's why I think different from other countries, we are in a plateau situation, not on a wave situation. So that's a general report of COVID-19 in Brazil.
Thanks, Marcelo. Are there any discussions on the refund or payback of insurance premium or other types of benefits to insureds?
Yeah, John, that's an interesting question. We have seen that happen in other countries, but we didn't see that very strong in Brazil. I think we can think about something like auto insurance. I think the first info that I think it's important to understand from the Brazilian market is that even though in some major cities and most of the capitals, you're going to see a high number of insured vehicles, generally in Brazil, only 30% of the fleet is insured. And of course, when you think about that, and you think about that people that have their cars insured, were using their cars to move inside Brazil, especially people that try to go to the countryside, try to go to get out of the big cities because they thought that things were getting worse in the cities. You don't see many people asking for refunds. So we didn't see associations going after this fight. We didn't see individuals going after that. So it's something that actually didn't pick up in Brazil any kind of refund or major refund or payback claims.
Marcelo, on property lines, is BI coverage subject to material damages? And what is the status of COVID 19 discussions in Brazil in this regard?
Yeah, in Brazil, for the time being, BI coverage are linked to material damages in the traditional concept that we have always used, is that there is a machine breakdown, there is a collapse, there is something that a damage that you can see that it's destroyed, it was in fire or something like that, and these would trigger business interruption. That has always been the case in Brazil. Policies are drafted like that. However, we have to say that we are facing something that's totally new here, and we see voices in Brazil trying to raise the argument and picking up from other countries that the material damages what's behind that is the usefulness of the property. So if it's not useful anymore, if I cannot use it anymore, even though there is no material damage, uh, uh, there is some people, I'll not say it's a lot of voices, some small voices trying to raise the argument that this would trigger BI coverages. However, just to come back to the beginning, this is not what we have today, and this is not what regulators have said. Regulators have said what's covered is covered. There's nothing to increase coverage because of the pandemic, and that's not what we are seeing in the courts because. We don't see that in courts because of different from other countries. BI coverage is not spread in Brazil. What we're going to have from BI coverage are normally big business, normally operational insurance or big property from factories, and really, we are talking about, for instance, fires and other types of accidents. But we don't have, like you see in other countries, mid-size, even small or big chain foods restaurants having BI coverage. So that's why we don't see that kind of discussion very much in Brazil, although we can hear some noises trying to adapt the concept that's well established in Brazil.
Marcelo, is COVID 19 force majeure under Brazilian law? And what is its impact on surety bonds? And would it be force majeure for future policies?
Yeah, this is an important point as well. So for sure, COVID-19 falls into the definition of force majeure in Brazil. It's something that we could not predict or foresee. It's unexpected that we cannot avoid. So I think it fills all the requirements. But one thing is to be force majeure, and the other thing is to be a force majeure event that exempts someone from the obligation to fulfill a given obligation, yeah, a given duty. And here is where we have to make the DNS assessment, especially for short bonds. So the fact behind that is that even though COVID-19 may be considered force majeure, when we make an assessment of short bonds, we normally exclude force majeure events. We have to understand, first of all, what is the impact of that force majeure in the obligation that has not been fulfilled. So we have to make a step-by-step analysis to see first of all, whether such obligation was in default before COVID-19 hit it. Secondly, we need to see whether such of obligation became really impossible or simply burdensome, because then we were going to apply different type of theories, the hardship theories or force majeure theory. And we have to establish very clear a link between the impossibility of that obligation and the COVID-19. Maybe the COVID-19 had no actual impact in the fact that the obligation became impossible, and the impossibility comes from other reasons. So this relationship between COVID-19 which is a force majeure event, and the impossibility of fulfilling a certain obligation has to be clearly established so that we have a force majeure event preventing you and using as argument that you cannot fulfill the obligation. And for future policies, I think we can say today that for COVID-19 is not force majeure because not expected. So what expected today is that people will have fallback plans, emergency situation studies that whenever we have a second hit or something like that, uh, companies will be prepared to deal with that. First of all, they need to be prepared to deal with COVID right now. Secondly, they need to be prepared if there is a second hit or something like that. Unless there is something out of the extraordinary, there is a new type of virus that nobody could expect and comes and hits strongly, then we could even argue that there is a second force majeure. But once the event of COVID 19 is there, it's difficult to argue that this would be force majeure for the purpose of contractual obligations and insurance.
Marcelo, how are COVID 19 claims aggregated for reinsurance purposes?
Yeah, we have seen in Brazil very few discussions about that, but they are, and they are not easy to deal with. First of all, because aggregation, the discussion of aggregation will vary a lot depending on the type of coverage that you're talking. If it's life, if it's property, if it's BI, if it's liability or casualty. So this is the first thing. Secondly, we have to understand what we are talking about. We are talking about a region, a country, what time frame we are trying to encapsulate here. So there are lots of things that you have to consider when aggregating claims for insurance purpose. And just to give an example, maybe we can aggregate hospital liability discussions when, for instance, in the beginning of the pandemic, the hospital didn't take the right measures to protect their own employees and people that were going to the hospitals to receive treatment. So maybe we can aggregate all these policies triggering from the event that they know that the COVID happened, but it's reached the country, but they were not fully prepared to deal with that. On the other hand, we cannot aggregate things that are happening in other parts of the country because this is a disease that comes bit by bit, and there is a huge variation from different cities and different states here in Brazil. If you remind what happened, so first of all, the COVID hit countries that were receiving people that were coming from outside the country, so people that were hubs for airports. Then it started to spread inside the country in different ways and with different severities, and with that it makes more very complicated to make aggregation tests or aggregation analysis. So the recommendation here is to try to analyze on a case by case basis, considering different the type of coverage you're talking and what happened actually in the country, in the state, or even in the city, taking to take into consideration geographical area and the time that we are considering.
Marcelo, what's the position of lawmakers and regulators, and what are the tendencies of some of the local insurance players in Brazil?
I'll begin with regulators. So our regulators, we have a regulator currently that has a very liberal approach. So they simply said it's covered what's covered. You have to read your policy. I'm not going to get involved on that. So that's their tendency. We had in the past some regulators were more consumer driven. It's not the case of our. Of course, they have consumer protection. We have consumer protection. That's not necessary under the insurance regulator, but that was the position of regulator so far. On the lawmaking area, so in the very beginning of the pandemic, lawmakers were concerned about two things: about health and life. On the health side, the regulator simply said on day one, said it doesn't matter what happens, COVID is covered. So it was very clear. So you have to understand that in Brazil, the health regulator that regulates health insurance companies, we have we call health plan operators, because they are not only insurance companies. It's one. The insurance regulator is another one. So from the health regulators, it's fully covered. So it's fully covered, including there was some discussions about testing, but most of the testings are covered right now. On the lawmaking side, there is a bill that's going on, and the idea of the bill, it's not approved yet. So the idea of the bill is to say that everything that's related to pandemic must be covered on life and on health as well. It doesn't talk about property, it doesn't talk about casualty, it doesn't talk about BI. The lawmaker was exclusively focused on the life and health portion of protections. And I think this law, it may be approved. It would have retroactive effect. It will deal with everything, but I think it came it's already too late, because once the regulator on life, on health, has already said it's covered on life, what happened? Even for policies that had a clear exclusions, the life players in the market decided to pay for COVID deaths for a multitude of reasons, but some of them are at the time, and even now, but at the time it was more complicated. Was very difficult to establish that the death was a death by COVID-19. And we have to differentiate death by COVID-19 and death because of COVID-19, which are different. Yeah, but most of the death certificates did not even mention COVID-19, because the physicians didn't even know for sure what was the cause of death. So normally it was a general statement. Secondly, because the penetration of life insurance in Brazil is not high, it's low. So even paying losses that technically would not be covered, the loss ratio would not be huge. And secondly, there was an assessment that disputing this kind of exclusions would be very difficult because of the situation we had in Brazil, because you couldn't assess what was the cause of death. You're going to expose people doing these assessments, sending them to the street and hospitals to make investigations. So the market took the approach that say it's better to pay than to discuss, and that's what happened in the life. The tendency right now is whether players would put a time period during which you cannot claim death for COVID, but even that has not been implemented. So far, people are living with that, and and the tendency is to continue paying. Maybe at some point in time this will change. It will change, basically maybe more clear for future pandemics, not for this one, but that's what we have seen in local players. So if there is some tendency, maybe at some point in time we are going to see maybe some more clear exclusions because people know what the disease is, or maybe you're going to see some time periods that for during which you will not be able to claim a policy for death related to COVID-19.
Marcelo, are there any major cases under discussion in Brazil courts right now?
No, no, not different from what we see in France, different what we saw in Germany. We have the FCA UK discussions, and we have the discussions in the US as well. In Brazil, because life players have dealt with the situation as I have described, because for health everything is covered, and now we are talking about casualty and property. So the only case that hit the press was amazingly was the filmmaking industry, and maybe because we have some famous case in the U.S. and these cases are replicating in Brazil. They basically deal, and this is public. They basically deal not with this discussion on coverage, but basically the discussion on renewal, because all these filmmaking productions have to be postponed, and sometimes even postponed they have to be extended in time, because if they needed 6 months to do that because of the pandemic, maybe they will need 8 months, 10 months, a year, which increases budget as well. So the discussion we are having here in courts are much more focused on whether how insurers can extend it, if they can impose conditions or not, impose new conditions, and how they deal with COVID-19 in the future. That's the discussion that we have seen in courts. Otherwise, what we expect is that in the future, and you have to understand that this takes some time, we may see some surety bonds discussions based on what we have discussed before, surety bonds claims discussions in courts if the parts do not settle when allocating the risk, what is covered by COVID, what's the impact of force majeure, what's not an impact on force majeure, and should be paid by the insurer. So it's possible that in the future we are going to have some discussions about surety bonds. I think at this very time people are trying to solve the problems and see if there is a claim to be argued, and if there is a claim, and if the claim is not paid, this will possibly go to court. You have to understand that. The insurance piece is normally the last one to move. Yeah, we have to people will try to understand what has happened. They will read their policies. They will reach the conclusion that they are possibly covered. They will ask for the payment of the claim. The claim will be adjusted or not. The claim will be paid or not. And only if the claim has been adjusted and not paid is at the time when we go to court. So we have a long tail here. That's why in court we have today basically discussion on renewals, because these are the first discussions that will come when facing COVID-19 insurance related issues.
Marcelo, thank you very much for joining us today.
John, it was my pleasure. It was a pleasure talking to you.
That was attorney Marcelo Mansur, who is a partner at the law firm of Mattos Filho, Veiga Filho, Marrey Jr., and Quiroga Advogados in Brazil. And special thanks to today's producer, Frank Bowinkle. And thank you all for joining us for Best's Insurance Law Podcast. To subscribe to this audio program, go to our webpage, www.ambest.com/claims resource. If you have any suggestions for a future topic regarding an insurance law case or issue, please email us at lawpodcast@ambest.com. I'm John Zuba, and now this message.
Best Insurance Professional Resources features valuable insurance industry content, including searchable profiles of client-recommended insurance attorneys, adjusters, and expert service providers. Brought to you by AM Best, known worldwide as a respected source of insurance industry news and information. Visit ambest.com/claims resource.